Hi, folks. Hello. Can you hear through this microphone? Great, great. It's good to see you all. Thanks for coming out to the Cook Center tonight. We're really happy to have this space and to be able to host these kinds of events for grown-ups and grown-up thinkers here on campus. The Cook Center is really our Trojan horse. It's designed to get people from the Bloomington community onto campus and to get the campus out into the community. And we've been hosting a lot of crossover events of that sort. We're part of the Gallery Walk for downtown Bloomington, and we've also been partnering with the Indiana Arts Commission on an arts and entrepreneurship program. And it's just great to have this sort of meeting space and to make good use of it. But tonight we're here to talk about The Chair, the Netflix series The Chair, of course. And in this job, I've been developing this this saying. It's kind of adapted from Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut said, "I don't know what it is, but wherever you go, there's always a Hoosier doing something important." And I'm not sure if he really believed that. I can't really tell. It seemed like a joke to me in the book. It appears, but I've developed this idea that wherever you go, there's an English major doing something important and something interesting. Tonight I just want to give a shout out to the writer and creator of the show, Annie Julia Wyman, who is a former English major and actually an English PhD student who wrote a dissertation on the comic novel. And Annie Wyman is doing something right, for sure. We've all watched this show. We've seen the characters, the settings. We've heard the dialogue, butts in seats, value added, and she just seems like she's ripping off our year-end reports to create this script, or at least our faculty surveys. Certainly, IU is this kind of giant public institution, is not like Pembroke in a lot of ways, the ivy-covered Pembroke that's featured in the show, but there are definitely some similarities. IU's administration can definitely be like complex and bewildering and scary at times. It's not for nothing we've been laughing here that the show is co-produced by the Game of Thrones creators. And we can imagine a similar series here with sort of House Valentine and House Luddy taking place on campus. But also at the same time, Pembroke is presented as a place that might be a refuge from all the bullshit. On the series. And I think that here at IU, we really can't claim that too often as a refuge. And the last year has been testament to that, for sure, with student precarity, social protests. The list goes on and on, vaccines. The administrators on this campus are exhausted because they're constantly managing that bullshit that comes across onto the campus. And I just want to thank these incredibly busy people for coming here tonight and talking with us about the show. So if you can please give them a round of applause, I'd appreciate that. If you're in academia, watching The Chair is definitely like a mixed bag of hot emotions, and we've experienced all of them. There are a lot of things that the show gets wrong, for sure. I mean, those faculty members are way too happy to be at a department party, it seems to me. And there are amazing things that it gets right. You'd be surprised how often people leave documents on the printer for other people to see. The list goes on and on. But we're here just to share our responses to the show, to open up a dialogue, to show the ways in which they do and do not reflect the things that we might have experienced at IU over the last few years. There might be a little bit of navel-gazing to this. This is what we do best. I don't know if people in the mafia have conferences about The Sopranos or anything like that, but this is what we like to do. We get together and we talk about things, and we invite the public to join us. So I just want to just do some quick introductions. These are all chairs or former chairs, and so we're really lucky to have their perspective tonight. Patricia Ingham is a professor and former chair of the English department at IU, and she's currently the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. Stephen Watt, all the way on the end there, provost professor, also former chair of English and former associate dean of the college. Valerie Grimm is a professor and director of undergraduate studies, as well as former chair of African American and Africa Diaspora Studies. We have Seung-kyung Kim, inaugural Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, former chair of the Department of Women's Studies and director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Maryland, Brenda Weber, provost professor and Jean C. Robinson Scholar in Gender Studies, former chair of Gender Studies, and Jacoby Williams, the rookie, 2 months into the job, Ruth N. Hall's associate professor in history, and the chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department. Thank you all for being here. Thanks. I am not a department chair. I never have been. I am only the chair of this panel. It stung a little when they call Bill like a disaffected white male professor type, but I will try to remain impartial throughout this discussion. I don't have a Joy Division t-shirt at all like Bill. I have a New Order t-shirt, but not a Joy Division shirt. We'll have 6 sections. Each of these fine administrators they've chosen a clip, and I'll briefly introduce the clip, and each one will present on that clip, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So I'm really excited about this. Please, if you can, there's an open bar there with beer and wine, and there are restrooms down the hall. When we get to the end of each section, I have a little bell, and I'll ring that, because I know these folks, and they like to talk, and I want to make sure that we're on time and we get through it all. So let's get started. Seung-kyung's going to present first. And we're going to begin at the beginning of the show with a scene that helps us think about who gets to be chair, how does one become a chair, what does it take to be a chair, what does it mean to go into administration, they call it the dark side here at IU, and what kind of authority does a chair really have. So please start the clip, Natalie. Thanks so much. Thank you. Seung-kyung.
Good evening. So when Ed first approached me about this panel discussion, my first reaction was, of course, I would love to participate. There are so many things that I can talk about this series. And then I began to think about, okay, so what it is that I really want to talk about. And then I got cold feet, so to say. And there are many parallels between Ji-Yoon Kim that was described here and myself. I myself is a Korean American academic, and I have served as chair of a department. And so there are some parallels between Ji-Yoon's life and mine. But at the same time, there are many differences, of course, do exist between us two, and I can go back to that later on if you have any questions. The chair has certainly grabbed our attention, those of us who are in academia, who care about such things as who is awarded the distinguished lecturer, or some of you may have looked at your, the part, what is it, the ratemyprofessors.com about your ratings. I never did because I didn't want to look at it. But those, all of you who are here, I think you are here because you do care. You do care about academia. You do care about what is going on. And the chair certainly does deliver a slice of what is going on in today's academia. As you saw at the beginning, Ji-Yoon Kim was shown as she is very proud of being the first woman and woman of color chair in the predominantly male, white male, older faculty member department. Although we have not seen it, she walks into her very large, opulent office, and as soon as she sits down on her chair, the chair collapsed. Again, that sort of, shows clear sign of the kind of a precarity that lies ahead of her. So department chairs are in a position of authority. But the job is also a burden. So many faculty members who are qualified do not want to serve as chair. After all, being a good chair does require a somewhat different skill set to being a great teacher or scholar. And most academics, including myself, are not trained as administrators. We are just put in there, and we live our life as we do go about doing our jobs. So some of us succeed, some of us fail. And that's what, many of academic jobs or administrative jobs are like that too. So as a department chair, of course, Ji-yoon is required to handle administrative things, but she's also a colleague in the Department of English. And as you saw that she said there's a declining enrollment, 30%. And that did remind me of the University of Maryland where I was. They were showing 30% decline in English major. It was, again, just kind of a jarring kind of memory came back watching that. Of course, the administration is looking at this from a cost-benefit or what we would call as neoliberal perspective, and wanted to get rid of most expensive, highly paid, tenured faculty who cannot attract as many students as they should be, according to the administrator. And of course, they do resist this change. So by the end of this show, Ji-yoon does not even last for a whole semester. So then why was she voted into this position? The stereotype does exist that Asian American women are demure, accommodating, always pleasant, and do not push too much. Race, along with gender, is central to the storyline of the chair, with Asian Americans occupying an awkward position outside America's central racial drama between the drama of black and white. Asian Americans may be perceived as relatively less threatening by the white establishment, but their acceptance can be interpreted as inadequate solidarity by black or brown people aspiring for change. Then why was she brought down? It's all because she was not easily controlled, and she did push too much. That's how she was brought down. So before coming to Indiana, I taught for 25 years in the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Maryland. I was chair for 5 of those years. Being the chair in a department where almost all faculty members were women and most were women of color is quite different from the English department at Pembroke. But I remember what the dean told me when I started in that position. She said, the chair is the front line in the battle between administration and faculty. And faculty members will be in my face every day. And that is exactly what Ji-yoon faced during her short tenure. I would like to end my remarks with a comment about the name of Sandra Oh's character, Ji-yoon Kim. Is an interesting assertion of identity. I appreciate that the full Korean name is being used, especially for an English professor, and that it was not anglicized, because it would have been very easy to anglicize June Kim. Of course, her name is a bit easier to pronounce for Americans than my name, Seung-kyung. Thank you.
Would any of our panelists like to comment on the scene or have a question for Seung-kyung or those remarks? Any of the panelists want to comment on the scene? Seung-kyung, I do have a question for you. The recognition of the character as Asian American was interesting on the show. She makes the comment that she's always on the college's brochure, on the cover of the college's brochure. And yet, when the students or other faculty talk to her about people of color, they don't seem to include her in those characterizations. And I was kind of wondering about the work that she needs to play representationally in the job.
Well, we always talk about Asian Americans as when money is counting, Asian Americans are not included in the traditional category of underrepresented minority. Otherwise, Asian Americans are counted as minorities. So it is a quite awkward kind of position, of course. And I remember in the department that we had one doctoral student who was a Filipino American. And he said that it feels like yellow doesn't exist in this department, at that department at the time. So it is a kind of an awkward and uneasy kind of conversation that sometimes we may have to do, talking about how we perceive of racial ethnic hierarchy and how we think about. So, this one says a little bit about it, but it did not go into it as much as it should have been, I think.
Thank you. Yes, Brenda.
I'm going to steal some of my own thunder, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about Sandra Oh, because Sandra Oh, I've been following her career for a lot of years since she was Christina Yang on Grey's Anatomy, for anyone who followed that Shonda Rhimes show. She was in Sideways, but she's in a show called Killing Eve on BBC. And one of the things that she said about that character is that when her agent sent over the script, she kept reading through looking for her part, not seeing anything that was marked as the Asian character. And it completely shocked her when she was being asked to play the title character, She is Eve, on Killing Eve. And she said when she had that recognition, it was a moment of shame at her own internalized racism, because she hadn't expected that she would be asked to play that kind of a role. And since we're talking about English, I can go back to my roots, right? Which is, I remember a line from David Copperfield where he says, it will remain to be seen if I can be the hero of my own narrative. And I think that's a really interesting thing about Sandra Oh in terms of the larger star text that she has, and how in this one, there's really no kind of precarity about this is her show, this is all about Eve in many ways, yeah.
Thanks so much. I think we'll move on to the next clip, which Patty Ingham is going to introduce for us, and we'll play the clip in a second. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Ed. Good evening, everybody. So the clip I chose is from episode 4, and the name of the episode is Don't Kill Bill. This was the episode in which Bill is first suspended. Bill Dobson, the sort of ne'er-do-well, charming jokester, who is suspended for his really incredibly kind of dunderheaded actions, some of which you just saw. So I have to confess that I think I chose something from this episode because until this episode, I sort of hated this show. I found it the caricatures and the satire incredibly annoying. I found it incorrect in many instances, and yet there's been so much talk about the show that subsequent to watching it, I've begun to hear that many of the things that are depicted that I saw as completely outlandish and ludicrous, people report to me did actually happen at this or that particular institution. So, so I've been lucky apparently in some instances. But so this scene that I've chosen is about 12 minutes into this 30-minute episode, and it features not Bill, but the senior Americanist Elliot, who is the one who is trying to really deep six Yaz's tenure case. We've already seen by this time, we've seen Jun's efforts to persuade Eliot of Yaz's many accomplishments, particularly her innovative teaching, and she tries, the chair tries to open ways for Eliot to identify with Yaz, comparing Yaz's ability to excite students with Eliot's own ability to do that, she says, in his heyday, in your heyday. And Eliot immediately claps back. "How do you know now's not my heyday?" He cries. And with that, he flings his hat toward a coat tree in the corner, and of course, it misses. So we get a hint there of what we're going to see more of in this particular clip, of Eliot on the decline, longing for a heyday that's gone. So this is the backstory to some of Eliot's motivations about his antipathy toward Yaz's tenure.
Great. Natalie, please play the clip. Great.
Great, thanks. So Eliot's treatment of Yaz is here revealed, at least in part, and this is obviously not the whole story, as motivated by the bad treatment of his academic wife, the, quote, best of us, that she received at the hands of his own department. She didn't write the tenure book because she was raising 3 kids and making dinner, and he didn't stand up for her. They should have stopped your tenure clock, and I should have put more pressure on them. I'm sorry. The I here, Eliot's I here, is distinct from a department they, and he didn't exert enough pressure to make it happen. So family life becomes the proximate cause of this wound, but Eliot's membership in the faculty seems not the solution to that problem. Once a bystander to what he clearly sees as an injustice, Eliot is now about to perpetrate the next one. Whatever complex wound he remembers, he is clearly inclined to pass it on to the next generation, to Yaz, even though she has, quote, published in all the highest venues. Something other than merit is at issue. And how can a chair like Yun persuade a senior colleague in the grip of this kind of ressentiment of the righteousness of Yaz's cause? Eliot's unnamed wife seems less bitter than he does, and we could think a little bit about this. Why is it framed in this way? So part of what seems to me kind of brilliant here, however, is what the scene does next. Eliot facing nighttime incontinence, presented by his wife with, quote, tranquility briefs. What a brilliant name. "This doesn't spell doom, old man," she says. And then I used to bestride the narrow world like a colossus. Well, now you are going to bestride it in tranquility briefs. That gets a well-deserved laugh. It's funny on its face, but also on account of its intertext. Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, Act 1, Scene 2. I'm an English professor, I can't help it. In that scene, Cassius works to persuade Brutus to stand up to Caesar and ultimately assassinate him. Here's the fuller passage. "Why, man, he," i.e. Caesar, "doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Men at some time are masters of their fates. Their fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." Eliot identifies his past self as a Caesar bestriding the narrow world. It is his present self that is diminished, and he, among the petty men, here meaning small, of little consequence, peeping about to find dishonorable graves. This sympathetic view of a sad sack Eliot is deftly done. His classes under-enrolled, sleeping in tranquility briefs, no longer the master of his fate. We can feel, I think, and are meant to feel, as viewers, a little sympathy for him at that moment. But when exactly was Eliot's Caesar moment? Not apparently during his wife's tenure fight. "They should have stopped your tenure clock, and I should have put more pressure on them. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves, and we are underlings." Having once submitted to an injustice meted out by his higher-ups, he is only now ready to occupy their role. This is precisely what makes him one of the petty men in the other sense of the term, small-minded, marked by narrow interests and sympathies. It may, moreover, be something of a compensation for his need for tranquility briefs that he will lord it over Yaz, a junior colleague with plenty of accomplishments, and with whom he shares, apparently, a love for Melville. It seems important in this context to grant Yaz the last word, or at least a last word. Near the end of the episode, in a conversation with Yaz about Elliot's negative letter, the one he has left on the copy machine for her apparently to see, June expresses a kind of sympathy this earlier scene has raised, at least in me as a viewer, for Elliot. Elliot still has a lot of institutional power, she notes, but he feels bad. No one wants to take his classes anymore. I see why you feel sorry for him, Yaz retorts sharply. He only got to rule the profession for the last 40 years. In its representations of interpersonal dynamics, the chair offers some pretty brilliant moments, I think, including a view of Elliot's limitations and our sympathies for those, his willingness to pass on the wound. If only the series could have offered a bit more imagination, similarly smart accounts, for the perplexing institutional issues it also alludes to, the so-called two-body problem, institutional histories that are not, shall we say, family-friendly, structures that undermine intellectual generosity or faculty solidarity. But those are unlikely to make for very good satire.
That's wonderful, Patty, and if anyone else would like to jump in, please do. But I did want to ask you, I love this idea about wounding and passing on the wound, and when you mentioned it a few weeks ago, I've been thinking about other wounded characters, and I didn't want to let the moment go without talking about Joan, who is just such a remarkable performance in the show. But Joan is also harboring certain wounds from the past. That I'm just kind of curious about the gendering of this, because I really, the concept of petty man is very useful, but I'm wondering how the narrative surrounding Joan might inflect this in a way.
Right, I think that's a great question. So I'm a medievalist, and Joan is a Chaucerian, and a lot of my medievalist friends loved her because she was so salty and edgy and had so much, and clearly the kind of wittiest member of that faculty, it seemed. I found her disdain for her students a little more troubling, and so I do think that there is a way in which, until that scene that actually happens later in the same episode, where she finds the kid in the library that has given her the negative rating on ratemyprofessor.com, and does this kind of really breathtakingly brilliant rant about how Chaucer is amazing and has all these, can outlast this kid's negative review of her. You're right that there is a way in which there is a kind of sympathy for wounds that are sort of doubled and trebled by way of race and class disadvantage. But I kind of think there should be a little bit. I mean, I was very fond of the character of Elliot in certain ways, even as I felt that there were structural aspects of his position and his experience in that faculty that helped produce his lack of generosity, right? So if he didn't rise to the occasion, some of that is also structurally produced. But he didn't have somebody talking about his ass when a colleague passed Joan, say, on the staircase and says, "You still have a nice ass," and she quite brilliantly says, "Too bad I can't say the same for you." So I do think there are ways in which this is kind of there's a certain sadness about the wounds that get passed on. I don't think pathetic men like either Bill or Elliot are the only ones that pass on wounds. But I do absolutely think that there's something about that structure that is also related to Elliot's advantage vis-a-vis his academic wife, who didn't get that same advantage.
Could I just add something to that? I mean, the most objectionable line in that scene for me is, I should have had the tenure clock stopped and put more pressure. The issue of stopping the tenure clock when I came to IU, Noni and I came to IU in 1985, was not an uncommon practice. But that practice was wielded largely by people of affluence, that is, faculty of affluence, who could afford not to be paid for a semester. That practice was put under, as it should have been, pretty strong scrutiny and was done away with, save in the cases of physical illness, adoption, childbirth in paternity, maternity, and health leaves of that kind. But just to say I'm going to stop the tenure clock, because I can afford to do that, and you can't because you can't afford to do that, is not the way to conduct a tenure review. It's inherently classist. It's inherently unfair.
Brenda.
Now's the moment where I have to be sure I don't say anything I'm not supposed to say about my department. So I will say, I just, speaking about academia, not about the show, that I think having the wound and protecting the wound and passing on the wound is very much a part of what academia is about. And it wasn't clear to me that Bill's overall letter was negative. Elliot, sorry. But that there were negative elements to it, because he talks about raving about the scholarship, for instance. And so I think in his mind, while he did have either a chip on his shoulder or a wound about his own personal experience, it was couched as if that's going to make my letter more plausible because it has some negativity. But I think more broadly, for instance, when a department sits down to think about what should its comprehensive exams look like, there's very much a commitment to whatever it is you had to endure is what graduate students now should have to endure. And it's very much a notion of not just wounding, but of almost hazing, right? That, and all done under the guise of rigor, so that we do this so that people will be more successful in the profession. And so I think that the show's missing a larger opportunity, even while I understand it's comedy and it's only 6 episodes and they were only 30 minutes, so I'll give it a pass. But it's touching on a much more complicated systemic problem in academia about a kind of fetishization of wounding that's a part of who we are and what we do.
And self-sacrifice.
So I find this conversation about woundedness interesting because there's an assumption that everybody get to say they're wounded. There are a lot of us who don't even get to say, I'm wounded, I've been injured, and I'm hurt, without fear of consequences of articulating that, as well as who caused it. So I even find woundedness and pain also a privilege for some to articulate and for others to keep silent about. And I think that dynamics really makes for unhealthiness in a department where sometimes the wounding of certain individuals is so obvious that it makes it very difficult for those persons to function in that space. So I just wanted to point out that everybody doesn't get to say, I'm wounded. And I think that is so unfortunate.
And just to your point, I think Yaz's point at the very end of this same episode is exactly that point. It's like, I'm glad you feel sorry for him, but, I'm not, there are 40 years of privilege that contribute to the sympathy that you're evincing right now.
Yep, Jacoby.
To turn a page a bit, away from the wounding concept, what's underlying here is ego. And academia is an institution of egos. And that's permeated from the first clip, through this clip, from Bill to Elliot and to Joan. So it's almost consistent across the board. That academia is an institution of egos, and everyone responds or projects their egos in different ways. Wounding is one, obviously, but what is at play here in this particular clip is the way in which Bill is not willing to relent, right? And that's much to do with his ego. And Elliot, I'm sorry, in this clip. In the previous clip, Bill, even though it is the chair's first day on the job, much of that clip is beginning the underlying aspect of the freedom and white male privilege that these academicians have. So instead of celebrating her first day in this first clip, it's all about Bill's silliness and his drunkenness and his way to steal a goat cart and so forth, as she's trying to balance this real academic, rigorous, and very disciplined position as the first person to hold that office, and dealing with the egos in the room, that she has to balance those egos. So egos is another very important trope that permeates throughout the, besides the obvious white male privilege. I don't want to keep focusing on that. But the ego aspect is consistent throughout all the various class dynamics that are brought up and so forth and so on.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize in that scene that you're talking about, Jacoby, like the carnival music is playing while she's giving her important speech, and it's completely undermining her gravitas and authority with his antics.
Yeah, yeah. We should move on. The scene that haunts me about colleagues is about egos is when Joan goes back to the Title IX office, which now seems to be legal counsel, because they're short-staffed, and she says that she demands that she wants someone to acknowledge what happened, and the staffer says, "I'm acknowledging it. It sounds totally illegal." And she says, "No, I want someone other than you to acknowledge it." And there's such a craven need for acknowledgement from students, from your children, from other colleagues on the show, and that was really painful for me to watch in terms of like a way of framing collegial interactions. But maybe we should move from colleagues to more pervasive structural issues within the academic system. And Steve is going to help us out with the next scene. This is the scene where June gets her charge from the dean. I know Steve has spent a lot of time in the dean's office. I'm very curious as to what he's going to be able to reveal today. So why don't, if we could play the clip, and then Steve will take it from there. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Steve.
Before I comment on that scene, can you hear me okay? Full disclosure, I'm 70 years old. I know my flowing hair could maybe confuse you on this point. And I retired 2 years ago at age 68. I did so because I wanted to. This scene really rings true in a series that caricatures savagely older faculty who bring their pills to department meetings. Carol and I were talking, we never have seen that, we've been around a while, who aren't sure if they've passed gas or the person next to them did. A perennial problem in faculty meetings. And so it raises the question, which we dealt with in the college and had to take a pass on. What do we do with faculty who are no longer really capable of doing their jobs when we are multiple $1 million in debt? I was just a junior deanlet, a little tiny dean, so they never let me talk about money. But it was more than the three salaries there. If you notice, the top salary there was $132,000 and change, okay? We're not talking about that. We're talking about several $1 million. So I am not, by what I'm going to say, advocating in any way that every faculty member over 65 or 70 or whatever should be given their walking papers or a cushy retirement package or whatever. That dean couldn't do that anyway legally. In fact, it would be a real mess if he tried to. So 3 historical points. In 1967, the ADEA Act, Age Discrimination in Employment Act, was passed. It offered protection for employees between the ages of 40 and 65. Some of you who are old enough may remember seeing faculty retire because they had to at age 65. I remember seeing that. In the 1970s, it was extended and revised to offer that protection to 70-year-olds. And then during the Reagan years, it was actually extended in perpetuity, thus effectively tying a university's hands legally and making the issue of helping older faculty in need of help much more complicated. I was in several conversations just like that one. So too, in 2018, was the Vermont School of Law, who sent 14 faculty members a letter asking them, actually telling them that by July 1st they must resign their tenured positions and accept a non-tenure eligible position at a lower price, or they would be terminated. The AAUP did a long case. I did a long study of that case. So the median salary was $110,000 a year. And let's remember that the senior faculty are going to make more than the median, as is the case here. So just to do the math, make it simple. Let's say they made $150,000 a year. Let's remember that benefits packages, obviously they vary from institution to institution. But let's just say, for the sake of ease of math, that it's only it's 1/3, 33%. That would mean that the several faculty members over 70 and approaching 80 at the Vermont Law School were taking $200,000 of money from a school that was $1 million in the red. Okay? So then the question is raised, could you actually do that with impunity? The answer is not really, but you can see the temptation. Our tenure is predicated on the notion that the state is not and the university are not in a case of financial exigency. That's a pretty strong stipulation in most tenure cases. So you can see how the temptation would be enormous if you're facing a financial catastrophe. I would also say that the case of Harold Bloom teaching from his living room at age 89 at Yale and hiring 2 former Yale graduate students at $10,000 a semester or so to proctor those classes strikes me as being offensive, which leads me to the next point. There's a faculty party in which Yee-Jun tells the dean, we're 85% white. And the camera cuts to those 3 and some other older faculty, saying as soon as one of them, or some of them, retire, die, or are fired, we might be able to hire some more faculty. My response to that would be, prove it. I don't believe it. So here's what I did, and then I'm going to stop. I wrote the MLA 3 years ago after the Vermont Law School, and again after Harold Bloom's passing, God bless him, and wondered what kinds of professional and shared governance can actually be mustered, not to make post-tenure review a negative, entirely negative phenomenon, but to make sure that faculty who need help get help. And then faculty, as we saw in my 8 years in the college. Did we have a faculty member come to a class wearing a raincoat, took it off, and forgot to put anything else on? Yes, we did. Did we have a faculty member not able to make class and have his spouse come and teach the class? Yes, we did. Did we have a faculty member, older faculty member, fall, slip, cut her head, appear before her class bleeding, and get calls then from the students? Yes, we did. Did the business school have someone drop dead from a heart attack in front of students? Yes, they did. And so the question, it's a real question. It's not a fake question. Why do faculty continue on? Many are afraid. We don't have an adequate support structure for senior faculty that even comes close to the support structure we provide our graduate students. Frankly, in my experience, many are not terribly financially literate. They're afraid to retire for both economic and psychological reasons. So my first suggestion is we need to do better on that. And the second suggestion is we need to have a real conversation about what a post-tenure review that is not an automatic firing slip or pink slip would look like. My old friend Carrie Nelson used to argue with me all the time when we were writing together. If you have post-tenure review, you're effectively doing away with tenure. If you have post-tenure, there is no tenure. I disagree with that. But it's a complicated matter. And third, and finally, I would like to know to what extent the money made by senior faculty actually would free up positions in the academy for struggling graduate students for whom now there is very little optimism on the job market, as all of you know. 2 jobs in Victorian advertised this year, 5 in medieval. When I was department chair, it was almost always 20 or 25 for those disciplines. Is there a relationship, and is there a way that we can help some senior faculty and then tell other faculty, like the guy who doesn't know if he passed gas or the person next to him did, to say, the time has come for you to find something else to do? That's my response to that. Because there are a lot of great faculty who are over 70 and over 75 who do a really good job and are still doing a really good job. So I don't want you to leave my comments or misconstrue my comments to say this is a blanket indictment of older faculty, which is what this satire does. It absolutely blanketly condemns all the older faculty that we meet. And I oppose that. I don't like it, but it points to a real issue. So, thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks so much. Yes. Yeah, panel responses to Steve. Seung-kyung and then Patty. Thank you.
So I have a question about this system. That is, when I came to IU, I heard about this system of golden handshake, yes. And so one of our department colleague was able to retire at age 65 with a guarantee of 5 years of salary guaranteed. Okay, so if we have that, maybe again the system that you're talking about can be imagined, but I doubt the university can afford that.
Well, I cannot tell a lie. For a year and a half, I retired at 68 and a half. I was the beneficiary of what was called the 1820 retirement program. That was terminated in 88, 89. There was a little fudge year there. And what it said is, if you've worked 20 years in the IU system, you could retire at age 65, and for 5 years, you would receive a sum of money approximating but not equaling your salary. By the way, there's a lot of misnomers about that. It's actually a very Byzantine calculation, assuming for all your years you had half in TIAA, half in CREF. What would those 2 piles of money be, divided by the number of months you're eligible, and that becomes the benefit. I'm sorry for that stuff. But that was done away with because it was an unfunded mandate. So, but that no longer exists.
Yes.
Except for old codgers like me, because I turned 72 months ago, my golden handshake has turned to copper. So.
Patty, yes.
This is just really more a comment, just the point that I completely agree with Steve's point that the problem with the job market and the problem of senior faculty not retiring are linked because so many people get to a certain point and are fairly confident that their field will never again be hired in. And so if they retire, there will not be any longer the teaching of whether it's classical Arabic or whatever field it is. This isn't true across the board, but it really does incentivize people staying on for the sake of their graduate students and for the sake of a program that they've worked 30, 40 years to develop.
It's absolutely correct. I've heard that line a couple times with Larry Singel, the dean, and I have heard that line before. And it's only part of the story because the person who usually utters that line has enormous hostility toward the college and the fact that their subfield in a discipline is no longer as prominent as it used to be. So the anger is understandable. That I get. But it then becomes a device, a wedge to use to stay way beyond what one should. And it's really kind of awful, frankly.
Thanks so much. We're going to move to the next scene, which Valerie will be talking about. Events of the past few years have shown yet again how power is distributed through seemingly neutral structures at the university system. When I put out the announcement about this event, we had such a great response from people who wanted to come and hear the discussion. But I also received a number of responses from people telling me that the show was triggering and traumatic to watch because it so closely reflected their difficult experiences with university administration. We talked about wounding, but also trauma, and I did not, it is my own subject position being revealed here, I did not realize that it was generating that response. But the next few scenes, I think, where we're dealing with younger faculty members and particularly issues of race and protest are striking a different kind of nerve very powerfully in viewers of this show. This scene is a very brief scene when students come to June's office to talk with her about tenure, particularly tenure for a colleague of color in the poli-sci department. So let's start the scene. Thank you.
So I chose probably the shortest clip, which is 29 seconds. But that 29-second resonate probably the longest historical conversation that's probably happening in this series. Because those 29 seconds resonate the struggle of African American women and people of color to be integrated not only in higher education, but to have positions where they are treated equally, treated fairly, and valued for who they are. So those 29 seconds really stuck with me. They kind of shot me through the ribs like, I don't know what. But I remember when I heard it, I just stopped. And in just a flash of time, I could see and experience in my mind's memory all the stuff W. Du Bois had talked about, Carter G. Woodson had talked about, E. Franklin Frazier, Ida B. Wells, Anna Julia Cooper, many other black intellectuals about the value of black people intellectual thought and about the value of what African Americans contribute to higher education. And so it resonated for a minute, and then I began to run my mind through my own experiences. And I began to think about the conversations I've had with black women all over this country about how they are valued within the academy, from Yale to the fake Ivies to others. And so it raised the question, when the students said that poli-sci has denied their only faculty of color. Now that was an indicator for the students that something is not going well at that school at Pembrose. That was also an indication for the student that they had to begin to think, organize, and get ready for a struggle. I don't know how many other students on the campus think about that as part of their work too. Your classwork is enough, but now you have to prepare for battle to secure the position of the only faculty of color who has taught you during your educational journey in the institution. So one of the things that the young woman said was that faculty of color are not perceived as rigorous. They don't meet the standard. They don't get invited to the same places. So in essence, what this student was saying was the assumption that is often made about faculty of color, but in this context, I'm gonna emphasize black people because guess what? I'm one of them. And so what I want to emphasize here is the assumption that is made in a lot of instances about standard, and that people of color don't often meet the standard. You hear this in coded language in searches, for example, when Dean's office said, I want to diversify the faculty. A lot of faculty come back and say, well, we can't find any qualified person of color. So, or they might say, if we can't find a qualified person of color, is it all right to hire a white male? But it's always what we can't find. And if we find that, it's going to be less than the standard. And we wonder then if that person, if we find them, you think they'll be able to get tenure here. So the assumption is that embodied in them is for those persons is this idea that they represent not only differences, but deficiencies. And there's no way we can hire a deficient person because we want to be in the U.S. ranking, and that person is going to pull us down in the U.S. ranking. So what those students resonated was the struggle and pain of inferiority being mapped on you. And it happens here all the time. So we're not talking about Pembroke, I'm talking about IU. The struggle that people of color, women of color have, women in general have, of dealing with this mapping of being less than and inferior. The interesting thing about it is that the students know it because they hear also the things that faculty say about faculty of color in their departments. They come to us and say, they saying this about you all over in Afro Studies. They saying that about you in Afro Studies. And I just want to pause for a minute and just thank Steve. Steve was a buddy in the struggle at one time, and I'm just going to leave it at that. He knows what I'm talking about. But the point I'm making is when you mapped as inferior, as brilliant as Yaz was, she was a victim of that mapping. It's hard to overcome that, no matter what you're doing. She was publishing in the right journal, but she wasn't quite doing enough. It's never enough. That's one thing the students know. The other thing the student resonated for me was the problem when you are part of a culture and climate that otherize. When the culture and climate otherize people who are not member of the majority, the white majority, it's a problem in the culture climate of the university. This is why a lot of the major PWIs fail with their diversity policy, because diversity for a lot of schools are being counted. One black man, we got him. Dakia, I know Dakia. That's why I'm pointing to him. So the failure of that. But when you can point to one, you celebrate, you dance a jig as if you've done something. And so the culture of otherizing, seeing different as deficient. This is why the student's saying, if she doesn't get it, I want you to know we coming at you, because this is one of the most outstanding person. The struggle with race, the intersection of race and space in higher education. What I heard those students say resonated so much for me of the study of Africana study and black studies in higher education at PWIs, and it would take a whole night and 15 rounds of whiskey to tell you that story. But it is a battle just to be treated equally, to be respected equally as a department, to be seen as a unit that is contributing to the campus more than the color of your skin. That's a battle. The stress and trauma that those students were preparing for, if she doesn't get it, we're going to organize, we're going to march. Well, they need to study. Students need to study. But the stress that they were feeling and the trauma they were anticipating by having the only black person that they knew who had been a great instructor for them likely to be fired. These are things when students are talking about when the institution doesn't feel good. These are the kinds of things they're pointing to. And then I want to talk, lastly, I want to mention how the students were thinking about not only marginalization, isolation, standards that are arbitrary, that only certain people are going to meet, and a lot of that has to do with networking and connecting with people. But that the students' comments really point to the problem when there's only one viewpoint, one way of thinking about how you get to somewhere. There's only one way to get to this. You either do it this way or it's not acceptable. You either think about it this way, it's not acceptable. The need for a more inclusive, expansive way of thinking about pedagogy, scholarship, tenure and promotion has arrived. The way that the gatekeeping is done in the academy by those who keep in the gate has to stop. The gate is going to get forced open because of the arrival of a new disciplinary way of thinking about encounters and experiences. Years ago, no one would have thought there would have been Department of Gender Study, Human and Sexuality Studies, Black Studies, Interdisciplinary Study, Culture Studies. And I'm saying this because if we don't widen the tent, that little narrow tent that exists is just going to fall in on our heads. And we're going to be left underneath that tent wondering who caused the sky to fall. We are causing the sky to fall. Because rather than grow and change, we are trying to force everybody to conform to our little narrow way of thinking. And that is not going to cut it in the 21st century. So those 29 seconds just said to me, get ready. The students are coming, and they're not taking that crap. And they're going to stand up for justice. They're going to stand up for fairness. And they're going to push for ways of thinking about things that are more inclusive than we imagine. And I cheer them on. I'm going to be there with them.
Thank you, Valerie. Responses to Valerie's comments? Yes, Seung-kyung.
Hearing you speak, and I just remembered reading one of news item from IU Bulletin, I guess, this morning. Our new president, announcing $30 million diversity faculty hiring. And I kept saying when I came to IU, it's been only 6 years, but when I came, I immediately realized this is a white country. This is. And what I felt was, again, what Valerie just saying, the kind of isolation and marginalization and the kind of a support not giving to, especially for African American faculty, I have to say. And so whenever I had a chance, what I spoke about is hiring is one thing. Hiring all you can do. If you cannot keep the faculty at IU, that's money wasted. And that's something that the administration really, they have to think about how to keep the faculty of color here, to give them the kind of power that they need to keep them here. That's the important part, I think.
Thank you. Jacoby.
Well, I promised myself I wouldn't personalize any of these damn clips. Shoot, here we are. Dr. Grimm opened the gate. There's too many episodes, incidents in the episodes that just, I wouldn't use the word triggered, but resonates and hits just too close to home. Your point earlier about Yaz finding that letter for her tenure file, that happened to me. The ways in which students are on campus fighting or I should say threatening to protest and organize around the one faculty member, the lone one, which I'm often in 4 different institutions, including this one, often the only one, advocating on behalf of that particular faculty member. That was me. And ironically, it's how I ended up here at IU from my previous institution in Kentucky, one of those same instances. Some of the same things that Yas is dealing with in this episode, these episodes, I should say, was my experience at Kentucky that pushed me here, that pushed her out from Pembroke to another university. Some of those same microaggressions, some of those same incidents. So yeah, it's just, some of them just hit too close to home, the ways in which those, for lack of a better word, tokenizations, or as Dr. Grimm articulates, bean counting, as filling the void, so to speak, and then what happens when you're there is very hard to retain. Recruiting is only half the battle. You have to also retain those faculty. And you, or at least I was, thrown into a hostile environment where I spoke my mind as I'm supposed to, and that rubbed people the wrong way, meaning you have this unwritten code for graduate students in the room about good citizenship. And what does that mean when you're going up for promotion and tenure? You meet all the marks, but is he a good citizen for our department, even though that's nowhere in the damn P&T guidelines, right? But they're holding you to that standard. So I sued them and won, which actually was a springboard to this particular opportunity here at IU. But those are some of the issues, that students were upset about the various incidents taking place on campus, and they will then come to my office, and then I have to navigate this as an untenured faculty person with these senior colleagues, many of which never invite you to their home, never invite you to dinner, never invite you, even here, I've been here 9 years. I don't know 90% of the people in the history department. I'm sure they hang out all the time. I don't get those invitations, but so some of those things are still very real, just to be quite honest about it. One small anecdotal example would be the hiring practices of recruiting and retaining DEI folks, but we just can't find a qualified person. One incident in Kentucky, we were hiring an Africanist, and the criteria seemed to change across these particular searches. So for one search, it was very remarkable to have experience outside the academy, in the community, maybe working for a nonprofit or a government union or the United Nations, for example, right? And that was very looked up as very promising. And then that changed when the actual African from the continent is one of the candidates who could speak multiple languages. It was seen as a negative. There's not enough rigor. And so, of course, the white male was hired over the Africans, even though the dean told us if we hire an Africanist or someone from the continent, we can get 2 positions. But these folks' egos are so arrogant, we're not going to let their exact words, we're not going to let the dean dictate what we do in our department. And so they didn't hire this person who was way more qualified, and hired the white male who is still there. So these kinds of episodes and incidents happen across the academy in all shape, forms, and processes. And so I spoke up at that meeting, and not to challenge them, but just to highlight the contradictions. We have whiteboards in our rooms. Let's look at the candidates. Here's the white male, here's the brother from the continent. Let's look at all his publications, accolades, and these other avenues that you think are positives, and they far outweigh the other ones. So why are we considering this person? He can't even speak a foreign language, which is a requirement of our job advertisement, but you still hire this person. And because I spoke up, I was considered not a good citizen. So you get these kinds of examples all the time. Just quite honest about it.
Thanks for sharing that. Jacoby, since you have the floor, I'm wondering if we could show the scene now. Now, this is kind of unfair. I asked Jacoby to talk about the scene, and he didn't pick it himself. But it was mostly because of his area of study and expertise. But this is the scene on the quad, Bill's quote-unquote apology that turns out to be anything but an apology. This is one of the most controversial scenes of the show because of the way that it depicts the students of Pembroke College. And maybe we could talk for a few minutes about activism, and then we'll have one more scene with Brenda, and that'll be the last one. So can we get this one queued up and started? Thanks. I haven't used my bell at all because you've seduced the timekeeper. I've been distracted just listening to you all, so thank you for that.
This is literally the proverbial catch-22, right? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. But Bill took a chance at it. You know, he gets some things right, but he gets much wrong. Frankly, what's taking place in the scene, I'm hoping I don't have to describe all that. I personally, I should say, love such engagements with students, personally. That unfiltered but informed conversations and debates about emotional issues and subjects. The classroom, for me, is, in my opinion, is one of the few places we have in our society where we can have open, honest discussions about controversial and emotional issues without the fear of repercussions. That's the purpose of the classroom. Kind of what Bill is trying to allude to, but he fails to do so. So he's right when he's talking about the university's values of discourse and engagement. We're going to disagree on some things, but civil discourse is what we do in institutions of higher learning and enlightenment. Me personally, I've been on both sides of this example in the clip, unfortunately. I teach what many on the right may believe is controversial subjects, like critical race theory, protests, social justice movements, civil rights, black power. I mean, heck, my most popular class is on the Black Panther Party here in Indiana, of all places to be teaching that. So as a professor, engaging students that may be what I call super invested in a particular subject, usually not well informed, but super invested in their positions against my courses, subject areas. We have these open, honest, robust conversations and debates. It's good teaching moments. And also, several times as a student, I've led many protests and campaigns against professors who I thought were just, quite frankly, racist, at the very least, at least racially insensitive regarding some of their pedagogical approaches, and just needed to be challenged in some ways. So aside from Bill's obvious white male privilege, I don't want to keep throwing that trope out there. Just his belief that he could joke about using a white supremacist symbol in the classroom. None of the context of what Bill was actually doing in the classroom was conveyed by Bill during the incident. So in the earlier clip, Bill is actually teaching a lesson, and he's using this salute as a attention getter. Then he goes into this remarkable lecture about these ideas of tolerance and so forth. The problem is one student takes a picture, and which our 21st century social media campaign sends it out, and it goes viral without any context. And so what Bill does in this clip is fail to not defend the indefensible, don't do that, but at least provide some context about what you were doing in the classroom to engage these students and to continue the conversation, and maybe introduce those students who were not there to the kinds of conversation you were having in the classroom. He doesn't do that. Instead, what Bill does, he gets angry and defensive, and in my opinion, just becomes very arrogant and paternalistic, which is why you can see the music trending in the beginning of the clip. Everything's going well, then the music starts and he gets silent, and then it snowballs downhill from there. So at the very least, in part of those kind of conversations, what he should have done, in my opinion, which I've done in the past, is listen and accept criticism, where none of us are above critiques. Agree to disagree in some areas, but all parties are heard and respected, and engagement continues and hopefully also evolves. Simply apologizing and respecting their position is the simplest thing to do there, and accept responsibility. And then also possibly use it as a teaching moment for some context, which he tried to do in the beginning. For me, the students' town hall regarding racial justice that's mentioned by one of the students, I think that was the most important aspect of that clip, for me at least, in that scene. It demonstrates both the faculty and administration's lack of support and involvement in an issue that is deeply significant to most of the student body. So you can see that disconnect between the students, the faculty, and administration. But that's also consistent with the academy. We have those same episodes and incidents here. This also speaks to Valerie's earlier point about why some students feel about, not feel good about, about certain academic institutions when they are here to engage these kinds of higher learning episodes. So I personally appreciate the students' passion, their spirit to continue to fight and challenge both legs of power on their campus regarding social justice, because students should hold us accountable. But at the same time, we must hold them accountable too. Hence my comments earlier about being super invested in a particular position without being well informed in some areas. But that's why we are here, to learn and engage. So what Bill does there is, quite frankly, uses his arrogance and paternalism to attack the students, to become defensive and not respect their positions, not engage them. And that's just not what we should be doing as academics. But also, I do believe, as I began, it's a catch-22. He's damned if he does, he's damned if he doesn't. That incident is not going to end well. I know he had positive intentions. There's no way that kind of controversial episode, after an image has gone viral in this day and age, is going to have a positive outcome. So I know I wouldn't have called a town hall and put myself in that situation, quite honestly.
Thank you, Jacoby. Thank you. Other comments on this scene and the depictions of students therein? Go ahead, Steve.
I totally agree. It's a really difficult scene, but I like your comment. It's amazing how often people will simply not apologize for making a mistake. And then when that gets rolled into the subject position of the person declining to admit some kind of overstatement or exaggeration, or in his case, just stupidity. I mean, it was just a stupid joke. He's talking about fascism as opposed to existentialism or absurdism, actually. And it's just stupid. But he couldn't bring himself to say that. You know?
It was consistent with all the other bonehead things Bill did in the academy. I'm not sure what professor he's supposed to represent. At any institution I've been to that can just get drunk, throw pornography on the screen, miss class, and there's no repercussions whatsoever. So of course, some of this is hyperbolic and exaggerated, but in this particular scene, the catch-22 is students, when they are invested, they are going to respond in these very emotional ways. So we have a responsibility as academics to kind of temper some of that, respect it, hear it, but also engage it. But what Bill does is go on the defensive and begins to have the wrong kind of approach, which spirals. Some of this is out of control, with the dean and the police officer, some of those things that he couldn't manage. But he started the fire. He lit that fire. But you can't keep doing these bonehead things. I will say one thing that I eliminated from my comments, but I guess I'll say now is, because I keep trying to avoid going back to what I think is the obvious undertones of the program is white male privilege. Trying not to keep bringing that subject up. But I don't have that freedom. As an African-American male, I don't have any of these freedoms Bill seems to present in these episodes. None whatsoever. When I enter the classroom, Du Bois is right. This idea of double consciousness. Here we are still evoking Du Bois over 100 years later. I'm often the only African-American in the room. Hell, I can go to chairs and directors meetings and still be the only African-American in the room. So my race is salient. So when I teach, I'm very conscious how I'm perceived. When I'm in those meetings, chairs, directors meetings, and so forth, I'm very conscious of how I'm perceived. My blackness comes first. I'm teaching these students, but I'm black first, who happens to be a professor. And I'm very conscious of that. And so the way I approach my pedagogy or any meeting, I'm very conscious of that. I don't have the ability to have the freedom of Bill to make bonehead mistakes, because that may somehow, indirectly, tarnish the opportunity for others who come behind me, or graduate students, or my representation of my department, and so forth and so on. So I just don't know what that freedom is. I kind of envy him. I wish I could just be willy-nilly and do stupid shit all the time, and can throw a finger up at the administration when my job is on the line and don't care. It's like, who wrote this part for this guy? This is not realistic, honestly.
It's actually, I don't think we have time to show it, but there's it was 2016 similar moment, right? Brenda at Yale with a white male professor who goes out to the quad to talk about incidents in the classroom, and it's scripted exactly the same way. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, you can find it on YouTube. It's 2015 Halloween incident at Yale. And basically what happened was that Yale University sent out a note to its students asking them not to dress in costumes that would be perceived as appropriating anyone's cultural heritage. And one of the faculty fellows in a dorm felt that the students, in the spirit of debate and critical thinking, should have that conversation with themselves. And they were angry at the privilege she showed, a white woman, in disallowing the experience that the university was trying to acknowledge. Not that we can give Yale a whole lot of credit. And in that case, her partner went out and had exactly the same kind of interaction with the students as Bill does here, and it's almost word for word. It's situated in the same way, where he's standing in a quad with the students all around, trying to kind of direct the discourse by allowing certain kinds of rational speech, and the students just having none of it. And but that got picked up in national newspapers and magazines as an egregious violation of free speech, right? So it's clear that Amanda Peet and Julie Wyman, the screenwriters here, were aware of that incident and were bringing it into it as a kind of intertextual moment to talk about sort of flashpoints in the academy right now, as well as kind of other things, around cancel culture and the Me Too moment and things like that.
Yeah. The main difference that I noticed in the YouTube clip, and which is real, and this show, is that Bill looks scared here at times. He seems misunderstood and scared, which is not something he shows in other scenes. And I'm kind of curious about the white guy scared at this moment.
He comes off as a sympathetic figure. You feel sorry for Bill, poor Bill. I mean, it's another sentimentality that's written, that undergirds the series. I don't feel sorry for Bill, honestly. I don't know many people like Bill. I think it's exaggerated in some ways, but there's some truth to some of the privilege, though.
Yeah, for sure. I think we should turn to our last scene, which also concerns Bill. One of the things that we really haven't discussed yet is that there seems to be two main narrative threads to the show. One is the sort of the administrative dramas on the campus, and then there is an entire family drama / romance between Bill and June, and they crisscross in really, really interesting ways, particularly around the character of Bill, who often seems like another child at the June's home. But Brenda's going to talk about this scene. It's between Bill and June, and we'll just play it, and we'll take it from there.
It's warm in here, and my panelists have had such amazing things to say that I'm going to be pretty brief. I completely agree with you. I think that the part of Bill is written as a kind of indulgent white male heterosexual guy that can kind of get away with anything, and we see Ji-yoon can't do those same things. So if you think of the chronology of the show, that the diegetic time of the show that it offers to you, it seems to open in January, it's super cold, and it seems to close in early spring. So she basically she does not stay the chair. I'll just spoiler alert. And it pisses me off, honestly, that she can't continue to be the chair. That somehow whatever he did so undermined her position that she needs to step away. And that the overall logic of the program actually endorses that, suggesting that they're both happier living outside of that administrative role or any kind of claim to authority or decision making, because they're there for the teaching. And in fact, there's a kind of moment in the hearing that happens later in this episode where Bill is sort of talking about the text, and Ji-yoon hears him talking about the text, and it's a sort of moment of minds meeting together, and so therefore she doesn't need to be the chair anymore because they'll always have the text. It's like Casablanca, right? So I found that really irritating. As many of my panelists, I've been on both sides of both of the town hall and of the debate where there are differing notions about what is the right thing to do. And I don't think that the show itself is willing to give credit to the possibility that there could be multiple truths happening here at once. It has the students speaking truth to power, and yet it also kind of pushes them off as an anonymous mob that can just sort of scream outside the windows and not really have a very nuanced position of what happens. And as we get to know Bill and Ji-yoon more, the credibility of those critiques is further and further undermined. So we feel sympathetic toward Bill, or we see he's a good guy, he can take care of kids, he can make dinner. All of these ways that are supposed to make him redemptive as this figure, and that the kind of romance plot that's happening there in some ways is meant to bring him back around. Now, when the show starts, at the very beginning, Ji-yoon opens a plaque, it says like, chief fucker, or big fuck in charge, or something like that. And she has gotten that from Bill. And so Bill had just been the chair. Now, we also know Bill is a hot mess, and he's lost his wife in the last year. He's, peeing in public places. He's like drunk. He's late for class. He doesn't verge into all of these other academic media stereotypes like the Wonder Boys, where he's sleeping with his students and all of that. And I was really intrigued that they never really wanted Bill to do something in their mind that was irrevocable, right? So he does do the Nazi salute, but he does it in this sort of moment of really bad choice in the classroom, not as some sort of ideological gesture. And they are kind of bent over backwards trying to make clear to you that Bill's just a misunderstood kind of guy, and that he really loves to teach and so therefore ought to be allowed to teach. I think that's the kind of larger logic of the show. And again, I found it really concerning that what they did with Ji-yoon's part in relation to that she has a ineffective power management style, that people really don't listen to her. She can't get much done. She doesn't have vision. She gets no learning curve. She just got thrown into the job and then yanked right back out of it again. And that's never held up as any kind of a violation of for her. That it really was. It's all to the good that she's not having to do this position of authority. And I found that quite disturbing. I also, you don't see it here, but Ji-yoon has a daughter, Juju, who is adopted, and that's really a huge part of the narrative that's being laid out here. But there's a very disturbing kind of logic about natural gender happening, where the mother figure is undermined because of her incapacities to mother. So Juju always picks Bill before she picks Ji-yoon. And what isn't really talked about that I think could have and should have been talked about, and it sort of speaks, Steve, to your point, is that she probably had to adopt because she didn't get tenure until her mid-40s, and because she was working so hard on her own economic security that her biological clock elapsed before her tenure clock did. And so not becoming a mother until you're in your mid to late 40s is not an uncommon phenomenon for women in the academy. Another reason why many people don't retire is because, like for instance me, I didn't even start my job until I was 41 because it took so long to actually get the PhD, right? So there's a way that those temporalities are obscured in this kind of a program that makes it look like, obviously, if you're this age, you're an old codger and you should be gone, and or if you're an adoptive mother, you're not as good a mother as the real father. And, there were just a lot of kind of disturbing sorts of messages, even as it was telling this so-called amusing story. That being said, I do think you should watch the show. And I want to give full credit not only to the screenwriter, the English PhD, but to Amanda Peet, because a lot of people have undermined her as being partnered with David Benioff from Game of Thrones. And that feels to me like a really unfair kind of critique to suggest that she can't be a viable screenwriter or showrunner because it's her husband that got her the job.
Valerie and then Patty, yes.
So I like your perspective on Bill and Professor G. I want to sort of go in another direction. Having sat as chair for 12 years when I was the chair, and when I became chair, I was the youngest person in my department. I was a woman, and obviously I'm African American. So the person we haven't talked about, and I lay 75% of the mess at his feet, is the dean. I think the dean is awful in this situation. And I think most deans are awful in conflict because they want to smell like a rose. Chairs are only the first among their colleagues. You're the first to take the hit and the last to get credit for anything that's happened that's good. But deans have power, and that dean could have taken control of Bill in a way where it wouldn't have undermined the chair in the way that it did. It left me wondering whether if the chair, G, had been a man, how would that dean have dealt with the male chair, whether he would have dealt with the male chair any differently than dealing with that woman. He almost forced her to be like Bill's mama. You take care of your boy and make sure he gets to where he needs to go until we have made a decision. And I think women chairs are often forced to be mamas, not only with colleagues, but with graduate students. And I think that is because of the lack of invested power and authority that the dean has to help with situations, and they don't. And so I think the dean is the most awful person in this scene, in this storyline.
Have you ever heard of a dean knowing the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock? That just would never happen.
What'd you say?
He knows Prufrock. That could never happen.
Yes,
I just
Patty.
wanted to say that, it's clear in a lot of places that the only power that June has is suasive power. She keeps going around and she has to try to persuade people to do the kinds of, sort of so-called soft power, whereas the dean is laying down the law that he can't enforce. And the only way she can enforce it without everything blowing up, right, is by trying to persuade and manage people, by being kind of emotionally intelligent in certain ways, even though she's also, on the other hand, sort of depicted in the way Brenda was pointing out as a, I don't know, maybe good enough mother or not quite good enough mother, in ways that are really difficult. There were two other points I just wanted to say, and one is that she does this brilliant thing with the David Duchovny subplot, where she gets an endowed chair for the department, right, so that he steps aside and doesn't do the, right? An incredibly brilliant and fantastic success, and yet she still has to step down as chair. I mean, like, why isn't she being, like, high-fived on the, So then the kind of fundamental question I have is, it seemed to me that the satire sits really uneasily with a lot of these really serious power questions that we've been bringing up. And so I guess I just have a question for everybody, which is, should this not be a satire? Is there something about the satire that makes it impossible to think about the really serious issues in anything but these sort of interpersonal kinds of, satirical ways, character flaws in this guy or that guy,
It's her dissertation. She is an expert
comic
on the
novel,
comic
right,
novel,
right,
but this
right.
is really
But
a tragedy. that
right.
she's-
I know we're running late, but I just have to agree with Valerie. No dean worth a nickel would throw a brand new department chair into, you got to get these 3 senior people out.
Right.
You got to take care of this guy who's made a terrible mistake and is going to get fired.
Right.
And no dean I've ever met would have Ronnie in the room discussing a personnel decision. That would never and should never happen.
Well, plus, she's supposed to be the prosecutor. She's supposed to present the evidence against him, which was a massive.
But the one thing that we didn't talk about is the lack of support of her colleagues, that she's trying to manage this ship at the same time. She have all these colleagues working against her, even the women colleagues as well, right? So you got all this, it's just too much to handle. It's just ridiculous.
Well, we're almost at the end of our time, if not have exceeded it. But I would like to just take maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if that's okay, just to hear what everyone's thinking about, or comments. Yes, Jen Mayer.
Thank you so much. I'm Jen Mayer, I'm from Gender Studies, and I want to thank all of you for being here. This was wonderful. I look forward to this so much. I did also want to add that there's a kind of elephant, oh, you can't hear me? Let me stop. That there's a bit of an elephant in this room, which is it's very clever to have chairs, talk about chairs. One thing that is also not represented on this show that is triggering for many of us, economics-wise, is that there's no representation, and I don't expect I study pop culture, it's not supposed to do everything, but the fact that there's no non-tenure track people on this, and that is the biggest bullshit ever. So while I have enormous sympathy for people that are making $168,000 a year and are afraid of retiring, there's a certain part of this that is also really kind of, upsetting and compelling. The fact that students are this pissed off, I think, has something to do with the fact that their administrative budgets that include that guy who's supposed to be the chair of diversity mandate, whatever his freaking name is, who makes more than all faculty, right? And I just wanted to say that I think that there could be a kind of class analysis also to this. So I think all of your readings were really, really, really good. Particularly, I studied pop culture and fraternity and stuff. I've been texting my son because I'm a single mother without tenure. So that's why I had to go so soon. So I just wanted to, not as a critique of the panel or anything anybody said, but I do think it's an important thing. And our students are also probably anxious and angry because they're exploited as workers, right? And I think that needs to be acknowledged. The university runs them, and they're not getting these salaries remotely. So I wanted to thank you all for that, but I didn't want to leave without saying something about what a huge gap that is.
Thank you, Jen. That's definitely appreciated, for sure. And there's a lot of interesting articles about the Seoul graduate student and the way that she's kind of caught in the crosshairs of all of this.
Can I say, too, that Annie Julie Wyman talks about having fallen into Harvard. I don't know how you fall into Harvard, but the reason she was available to go into television and to write scripts is because she couldn't get a job in academia. So she had a story to tell, and it didn't make it into this text.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you. Good to see you. Any other comments from the audience? Yes, sir.
So as leaders, how do you manage all of the different personalities you have to interact with and meet your colleagues?
That's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
Well, I spend a lot of time with my colleagues, and one-on-one time, I would go to lunch with them. When they would take their smoke breaks, I don't smoke, but I would go down and just take the smoke, inhale the smoke, because I wanted to hear what they were thinking. I learned what they could take. I had one colleague I know, if I had to vote on something very critical, I know his patience for a lot of craziness wasn't long, so I would say to him, I'm gonna start the meeting with the vote. 20 minutes, this vote is going to happen. If you can hang on 20 minutes, you can go. And so I think I think that is one part of it, but what I tried to do was to keep the department out in front, that this is our house and this is where we live. We're either going to make it strong together, we're going to burn it down separately. And I think I just kept trying to say, we have to stick together, we have to stick together. And some people heard that message, and that just comes out of the struggle of black people. And understanding when you're small in numbers, you have to stick together. And so some people bought into that, other people didn't quite understand the idea that in the house we can have issues, but outside of the house, you can't. And I try to push a lot about how you be professional. You can talk about your colleagues around the table, but when you're outside of your department, you don't bash your colleagues. You don't talk about your department. And so I tried to model for them what I thought was a healthy way of being both open about. I told them, you got an issue with me, you can come to my office because I can get you off of me. And so, but if you got something you want to say outside of me, then there's a way we can talk about that too. So I think just saying, this is what we have. This is the house that working together is going to build, or not working together is going to destroy. And I said that every faculty meeting, we're going to have to choose which one of these roads we want to take. And so the buy-in comes from that. And it's not easy, because faculty members are also individuals. And you always got somebody who is greater in their eyes than what the record indicates. And you have to deal with that.
If I can just add in here, I completely agree with everything you said. The other thing I would just say is that one of the rules I had when I was chair, and I was the second woman chair in this English department here in its history, and the first one in like 25 years, so there was some learning curve of the department, I think, getting used to, right? But one was I made a commitment to myself that I was never going to be defensive, that I was going to let people say what they wanted to say, and part of how I managed that for myself was by thinking about the fact that part of the way people were reacting to me wasn't about me, Patty, it was about the fact that I was in this role. And there was, there's this thing called the king's two bodies that I study in medieval history, where there's the body of the king, the actual physical person who's the king, but then there's just the body of the king in the position. I began thinking about the chair's two bodies, and so really trying not to take things personally, even though there were, believe me, plenty of opportunities when, and things may even have been meant personally, but that kind of helped me be better able to listen to people and hear why they were acting in the ways that they were acting that was destructive, or that was not, sort of helpful in moving forward. So, and it's exhausting. So it's why, I was 4 years and out. I'm done.
Well, I also think that the question about dealing with all those people. I was chair for 5.5 years and a dean for 8.5 years, and I learned, I think, my first term as chair, there are going to be a certain percentage of faculty. At that time, there were, Patty, 55 or 60 faculty and 125 graduate students. So there are a lot of people to talk to. There are going to be 5 or 6 people that you are not going to let push you around and bully you, raise your blood pressure. I had a faculty member email on Friday night, 10:45 p.m., 11:15 p.m., 12:05 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 1:45. And so I just said, I'm not reading any more of your emails. Just not going to do it.
And
You're not going to bully me by email. And I know other people on this panel have been in analogous situations. Let's put it that way.
I think maybe we should stop there. I wanted to say something about this, that there's an interesting article, I think it's in maybe the Atlantic, by Kevin Detmar, who's a chair at Pomona right now. And he makes this point that just really rung true with me, is that certainly at a big university like IU, there's an economy of enrollments and big salaries and big egos and an economy of rankings that we all hear about all the time. And then there's this other economy that you don't see or hear about, and it's an economy of care between the people that work in the buildings here, and that's the economy that really makes the university tick and hold together. All of these people, just even doing this panel, which is an uncompensated panel, right? They're doing this because they care, for no other reason. And these chairs care, and my staff cares, and our student interns care, and they're all here right now, keeping this all together. It doesn't run without that at all. And I think that the show at its best shows that people caring and trying to make it work for each other. So I want to thank everyone that was involved in this wonderful production tonight, and I want to thank everyone who showed up. We're recording it. It'll be online soon, I hope, so you can share it with others. But I'll email you all to let you know it's out. But thanks again. Please, a round of applause for these wonderful people.